August 30th, 1918. 3 gunshots rang out at the Michelson plant in Moscow. Vladimir Lenin, the man who had just shaken the world with the October Revolution, collapsed into a pool of his own blood. His assassin was not a powerful army, but a lone woman driven by pure hatred. Lenin miraculously survived that fateful night, but he would never truly recover. The bullets lodged deep in his neck and lung became a ticking time bomb. They slowly drained the Soviet leader's strength, day by day forcing him into a final chapter of agony, helplessly watching power slip from his grasp as he lay on his deathbed. From the trauma of his brother's execution by the Tsar when he was just 17, to the cold-blooded decisions that redrew the map of the world, and finally, a secret political testament buried for decades. Behind the towering monuments, what was the true price paid by the man himself? Lenin was not operating in a courtroom. He was operating in a war zone where the law had ceased to exist. The summer of 1918 was not just chaotic, it was apocalyptic. The Bolsheviks held power in name only, trapped in Moscow, while the rest of Russia was carved up by foreign armies and local warlords. Every border was a front line, but the most immediate threat wasn't military, it was caloric. The revolution was not dying from bullets, it was dying from hunger. The cities were starving. The transport systems had collapsed, and bread rations in Moscow had fallen to mere crumbs. People were mixing chaff into flour and trading priceless family heirlooms for a single sack of rotting potatoes. In the countryside, the peasants who had initially supported the revolution in the hope of owning land were now hiding their grain. They refused to hand over their harvest to feed the cities that gave them nothing in return. To Lenin, this was not a survival tactic by poor farmers. It was an act of counter-revolutionary war. He labeled them kulaks, a term that theoretically meant wealthy peasants, but in practice became a death sentence for anyone who resisted. Lenin looked at this starvation and saw a lack of discipline. He was a student of history, specifically the French Revolution. He idolized Robespierre and the Jacobins. He believed their mistake was not that they used the guillotine, but that they put it away too soon. Iron and blood, he told his colleagues. Without terror, the revolution is impossible. This was not sadism. It was, in his mind, a terrible necessity. He viewed the revolution as a birth, and birth is always bloody. If 100 men had to hang to save 1,000,000 from the return of the Tsar, Lenin would sign the order without a tremor in his hand. He had convinced himself that morality was a bourgeois luxury. The only morality that mattered was the survival of the Bolshevik state. By late August 1918, the tension in Moscow had reached a breaking point. The humid summer air felt heavy with impending violence. The Bolshevik leadership lived in a state of siege, sleeping in the Kremlin with revolvers on their nightstands. The paranoia was justified. On the morning of August 30th, in Petrograd, Moisey Uritsky, the head of the local Cheka, the secret police, was assassinated. He was shot dead in the lobby of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The news traveled down the telegraph wires to Moscow like an electric shock. The enemies of the revolution were no longer just gathering armies on the frontier. They were inside the gates, armed and waiting. Despite this assassination, despite the pleading of his sister and his security chief, Lenin refused to cancel his schedule for the day. It was a Friday, the day he traditionally spoke to the workers. He believed in the power of his own voice. He believed that if he could just stand before the people, explain the crisis, and ignite their revolutionary fervor, he could hold the regime together. It was a fatal hubris. He felt invincible, or perhaps he simply felt that hiding was a sign of weakness that the Bolsheviks could not afford. "We do not hide," he said, "we fight." That evening, Lenin's car, a black Rolls-Royce requisitioned from the Tsar's garage, wound its way through the darkened streets of Moscow toward the Michelson factory in the Zamosk-Vorekye district. The factory was a stronghold of worker sentiment, a cavernous industrial cathedral of steel and soot. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and machine oil. Thousands of workers were packed in, tired, hungry, and angry. They wanted answers. They wanted bread. Lenin took the stage. He was not a physically imposing man, short, balding, with a goatee that made him look more like a university professor than a warlord. But when he spoke, he was electric. He leaned forward, gripping the lectern, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He spoke of the dictatorship of the proletariat, of the foreign imperialists trying to choke the young Soviet Republic, of the need for sacrifice. For an hour, he held them in the palm of his hand. He was the architect, explaining the blueprint of a new world, a world that required them to endure the unendurable a little longer. As the speech ended, the applause was thunderous. Lenin stepped down from the platform, wiping sweat from his brow. He moved toward the exit, surrounded by a loose cluster of workers and guards. The mood was triumphant. He had done it again. He had turned their anger into resolve. He walked out into the cool evening air of the factory courtyard, where his car was waiting. The engine was idling. His driver, Stepan Gil, had the door open. Lenin paused. A group of women had gathered near the car, complaining about the confiscation of flour on the trains. Lenin, ever the politician, stopped to listen. He had one foot on the running board of the car. He turned his head to answer them, his profile illuminated by the dim light of the factory lamps. In the shadows just a few feet away, a figure was watching. She had been waiting for hours. She was not a white guard officer or a foreign agent. She was a woman named Fanny Kaplan. She was 28 years old, with eyes that burned with a fanatical intensity. A member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, she had spent years in Tsarist labor camps, losing her eyesight and her youth in the frozen dark of Siberia. She believed that Lenin had betrayed the revolution. She believed he had stolen the freedom they had fought for and replaced the Tsar's tyranny with his own. In her pocket, her hand gripped the cold steel of a Browning pistol. She watched him turn. She saw the vulnerability of his neck, the exposed line of his back. She stepped forward. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade. She raised the gun. 3 shots shattered the noise of the factory. Dry, popping sounds. Before the crowd could even scream, the architect of the revolution jerked forward violently. The reality of the moment collapsed onto the courtyard in a split second. He grabbed at the air, his face twisting in a look of confusion rather than pain, before crumpling onto the cobblestones. His hat rolled away. A dark stain began to spread rapidly across the shoulder of his heavy overcoat. Chaos erupted. It was a primal, panicked scene. Women screamed and scattered, dropping their bags. The factory workers, who moments ago were cheering, froze in horror. Stepan Gil, Lenin's driver, was the first to react. He drew his revolver, scanning the darkness, shouting for the crowd to get back. But the shooter had not fled. Fanny Kaplan stood amidst the mayhem she had created, unnervingly calm. She had dropped the pistol. She made no attempt to blend into the fleeing crowd. When a group of workers and Red Guards rushed her, grabbing her arms and pinning her against the wall, she didn't fight. She didn't scream. She simply stared at the fallen leader with the cold satisfaction of a soldier who has completed a mission. On the ground, Lenin was conscious but fading. He was groaning, his breath coming in shallow, wet rasps. The bullets had done terrible damage. One had passed harmlessly through his coat, but the other 2 were devastating. One had struck his left shoulder, shattering the bone. The other, the lethal one, had entered his neck, puncturing the upper part of his left lung and lodging dangerously close to his spine and the major arteries. If the bullet had been a few millimeters to the right, he would have died instantly. Panic gripped his entourage. They lifted him off the ground, his blood soaking their hands. They shoved him into the back of the Rolls-Royce. Stepan Gil jumped behind the wheel, his hands shaking. "To the hospital!" someone shouted. But Gil hesitated. In 1918, in a city crawling with enemies, a hospital was a trap. Who could be trusted? Which doctor was a white sympathizer waiting to finish the job with a scalpel? The decision was made in a split second. To the Kremlin. They would take him to the fortress. If he was to die, he would die in the seat of his power. The drive back to the Kremlin was a blur of speed and terror. Gil drove like a madman, tearing through the darkening streets of Moscow, honking the horn relentlessly. In the back seat, Lenin lay pale and gasping. He was bleeding internally. He whispered, asking what had happened, asking if it was a heart attack, his mind unable to grasp that he had been shot. The irony was palpable. The man who had authorized the Red Terror, who had just ordered the hanging of peasants to instill fear, was now bleeding out on the leather seats of a luxury car, a victim of the very violence he had championed. When they arrived at the Kremlin, there were no stretchers. In the panic, no one had thought to call ahead for medical equipment. The leader of the revolution had to be carried up the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment in the arms of his colleagues. They laid him on his simple iron-frame bed. His coat was cut away, revealing the ugly, dark holes in his flesh. His wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, stood by the door, her face a mask of shock. She was a revolutionary veteran hardened by years of exile and prison, but seeing her husband, her partner in everything, broken and bleeding, shook her to her core. Doctors were summoned from across Moscow. They arrived in a flurry, breathless and terrified. To operate on Lenin was a task fraught with impossible pressure. If he lived, they were heroes. If he died under their knives, they would almost certainly be accused of treason and executed. The room became a makeshift operating theater. The air smelled of rubbing alcohol and the metallic tang of blood. The doctors argued in hushed tones over his prostrate body. The wound in the neck was the problem. The bullet was lodged deeply, pressing against the unimaginable complexity of nerves and vessels near the collarbone. To remove it now, with Lenin so weak and the equipment so primitive, could cause a fatal hemorrhage. They made a gamble. They would clean the wounds, stop the bleeding, but leave the bullet in his neck. While Lenin fought for his life in the bedroom, a different kind of operation was taking place in the basement of the Lubyanka, the headquarters of the Cheka. Fanny Kaplan was being interrogated. She sat in a wooden chair surrounded by men who made a profession of pain, but she remained stoic. She refused to name accomplices. She refused to apologize. Her confession was simple and devastatingly clear. "My name is Fanya Kaplan. Today I shot at Lenin. I did it on my own. I will not say who gave me the revolver. I resolved to kill Lenin long ago. I consider him a traitor to the revolution." She was not a monarchist. She was a socialist who believed Lenin had betrayed the dream of 1917. She was the mirror image of his own fanaticism. Her fate was sealed the moment the trigger was pulled. There was no trial. There was no public hearing. 3 days later, on September 3rd, on the orders of Yakov Sverdlov, the chairman of the Central Executive Committee, Kaplan was taken to the Kremlin garage. The roar of car engines was used to mask the sound of the execution. Pavel Malkov, the commandant of the Kremlin, raised his pistol and shot her in the back of the head. There was no burial. Her body was doused in gasoline and burned in an iron barrel in the Alexander Garden, right outside the Kremlin walls. The smoke of her burning corpse drifted up into the Moscow sky, a grim signal that the time for mercy had ended. Lenin's survival was miraculous, but his recovery was the catalyst for a nightmare. As he lay in bed, drifting in and out of fever dreams, his lieutenants, Sverdlov and Dzerzhinsky, unleashed the full fury of the state. The assassination attempt was not treated as the act of a lone radical. It was framed as a vast, orchestrated conspiracy by the dying bourgeois class. The response had to be total. On September 5, 1918, the Bolshevik government officially passed the decree on Red Terror. The language of the decree was bureaucratic, but its effects were apocalyptic. It stated that it was essential to protect the Soviet Republic from class enemies by isolating them in concentration camps, and that all persons involved in White Guard organizations, conspiracies, and rebellions are to be shot. The restraints were off. The Cheka was given the power of judge, jury, and executioner. In Petrograd, the response to the shooting of Lenin and the murder of Uritsky was immediate and horrific. 512 hostages, former ministers, professors, officers, and priests, were dragged from their cells and executed in a single night. They had nothing to do with Kaplan. Their crime was their existence. They were class enemies, and their deaths were a blood sacrifice to the wounded leader in Moscow. The logic of the hanging order in Penza was now the law of the land. Barges filled with prisoners were towed out into the middle of the Volga River and sunk, drowning everyone on board. In Kiev, the Cheka executioners worked in shifts, the floors of the garages awash in blood and brain matter. The terror was not just about killing, it was about psychological domination. It was designed to traumatize the population into absolute submission. Newspapers published lists of the executed, column after column of names, a daily scorecard of death intended to show the futility of resistance. Lenin, recovering in his Kremlin apartment, did not shrink from this. When he was strong enough to read the reports, he did not call for moderation. He approved. In his mind, Kaplan's bullet proved he was right. The enemy was ruthless, so the revolution had to be more ruthless. He wrote to a colleague during his convalescence, "We must encourage the energy and the massive nature of the terror." He saw his own survival as a sign that history was on his side, that he was destined to lead this grim purification. But the bullet in his neck was not done with him. Physically, Lenin healed. He returned to work in late 1918, walking with a slight stoop, his face paler, his eyes harder. The propaganda machine went into overdrive, painting him as an immortal figure, the man of steel who could not be killed by capitalist bullets. "Lenin lives," the poster screamed. He threw himself back into the grinding work of governing a starving, war-torn nation. Yet unseen and unspoken, the damage was compounding. The lead bullet, still lodged near his spine, was a ticking time bomb. It pressed against the carotid artery and the nerves. It may have slowly poisoned his blood with lead. He began to suffer from blinding headaches that would leave him prostrate in a dark room for hours. He experienced sudden bouts of insomnia, pacing the floor of his apartment until dawn, the silence of the Kremlin amplifying the ringing in his ears. His temper, always short, became explosive. He would fly into rages over minor bureaucratic delays, his face turning crimson, the veins in his neck bulging, the neck that still harbored the metal of his assassin. By 1921, the Civil War was won. The white armies were crushed. The foreign interventionists had gone home. The Bolsheviks were the masters of Russia. But the victory felt hollow to the man at the top. The country was in ruins. Famine was stalking the Volga region, the very place he had ordered the hangings, killing millions. Cannibalism was reported in the villages. The sailors of Kronstadt, the pride and glory of the revolution, mutinied against the Bolshevik dictatorship, and Lenin had to order them slaughtered across the ice. The stress was eating him alive. The man who had survived the assassin's bullet was being destroyed by the weight of the crown he had forged. He began to complain of noise in his head. He found it hard to concentrate. He would lose his train of thought in the middle of a sentence, staring blankly at his comrades, a look of terrified realization in his eyes. He sensed that his body, the vessel of his intellect, was betraying him. In May 1922, the doctors decided that the bullet in his neck should finally be removed, hoping it would alleviate his symptoms. The surgery was performed by a German specialist. It was successful. The bullet was extracted, but the relief was short-lived. The trauma of the surgery, combined with the years of extreme stress and likely an underlying genetic condition, triggered a catastrophic collapse. Just weeks after the surgery, while recovering at his country estate in Gorky, Vladimir Lenin woke up to find that he could not move his right arm. He tried to call out to his wife, but his speech was slurred, the words tumbling out like stones. The great orator, the man whose voice had commanded millions, was suddenly a prisoner in his own body. He had suffered his first major stroke. The architect of the Red Terror was now helpless. He was confined to a wheelchair, dependent on nurses and his wife for the most basic bodily functions. And it was in this state of vulnerability, stripped of his power to command, that he began to see the true face of the regime he had built. He began to see the wolves circling. And the hungriest wolf of all was the man he had once called the Wonderful Georgian, the man who was now controlling access to his sick room, filtering his mail, and slowly, methodically stealing his empire, Joseph Stalin. The silence of the Gorky estate was absolute, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the revolution that had defined Vladimir Lenin's life for decades. Located 20 miles south of Moscow, the neoclassical mansion had been seized from a wealthy general, its rooms filled with velvet furniture and crystal chandeliers, remnants of the very aristocracy Lenin had destroyed. Now it was his hospital, his fortress, and his prison. Following the stroke in May 1922, the man who had redrawn the map of the world was reduced to the geography of a single room. The paralysis in his right side was a terrifying cage. For a man whose power lay in his ability to articulate complex thoughts, the slur in his speech was not just a medical symptom, it was a humiliation. The summer of 1922 became a season of grueling rehabilitation. Lenin was not a patient who accepted frailty. He attacked his recovery with the same ferocious discipline he had applied to the study of Marx. He forced himself to engage in physical exercises, dragging his numb leg across the floorboards. He practiced speaking, repeating vowels until his jaw ached, trying to mold the moosh in his mouth back into the sharp, weaponized language of the Bolshevik leader. He learned to write with his left hand, his scrawl shaky and childlike, a painful shadow of his former decisive script. To the doctors, he was a difficult case. To his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, he was a husband fighting a battle he could not win against his own biology. While Lenin fought his private war at Gorky, a different kind of war was being waged in the smoky offices of the Kremlin. The power vacuum he left behind was not remaining empty. It was being filled by the Secretariat, the administrative engine of the party, and at its controls sat Joseph Stalin. Just months before his stroke, Lenin had supported Stalin's appointment as General Secretary. At the time, it was seen as a housekeeping role, a position for a bureaucrat to manage personnel, files, and appointments. Lenin had viewed Stalin as a useful tool, a crude but effective organizer who could handle the dirty work that the intellectuals like Trotsky disdained. It was a fatal miscalculation. Lenin had assumed the general secretary would serve the party. Instead, Stalin was making the party serve the general secretary. From his sickbed, Lenin began to notice a disturbing change in the flow of information. Reports were delayed. Letters went unanswered. Visitors were turned away at the gates of Gorky, citing medical orders that originated from Stalin's office. Stalin was using his concern for Lenin's health as a pretext to isolate him. He was building a wall around the leader, brick by brick, under the guise of protecting him. Lenin, whose political intuition was sharper than any man alive, began to sense the trap closing. He realized that the wonderful Georgian was quietly placing his own loyalists in key positions across the Soviet Union. The bureaucracy was metastasizing, and it wore Stalin's face. By October 1922, Lenin had made a miraculous, albeit partial, recovery. He returned to Moscow, determined to retake the reins. He walked into his office smelling the stale air of the Kremlin and found a stranger's house. The atmosphere had shifted. The camaraderie of the early revolutionary days was gone, replaced by a sycophantic hierarchy. He saw the swelling ranks of officials who cared more about their rations and privileges than the cause of the proletariat. He called them scoundrels and bureaucratic flies. But his greatest fury was reserved for a specific political crisis that revealed Stalin's true character, the Georgian affair. Stalin, himself a Georgian, was brutally enforcing Moscow's control over the smaller Soviet republics. He wanted to absorb Georgia directly into the Russian Federation, stripping it of its autonomy. When Georgian communists protested, Stalin's enforcer, Sergo Ordzhonikidze, physically struck a Georgian leader during a dispute. When news of this reached Lenin, he was appalled. He saw it as a return to the imperialist bullying of the czars. He realized that Stalin was not building a union of equals. He was building a new Russian empire painted red. Lenin, the man who had ruthlessly crushed dissent, suddenly found himself in the position of the dissenter, horrified by the great Russian chauvinism he saw in his protege. The tension exploded in a personal incident that would sever the bond between the two men forever. In late December 1922, while Lenin was resting, Stalin learned that Lenin had been secretly dictating letters to his secretaries, violating the strict medical regimen Stalin had imposed. Furious that his blockade had been breached, Stalin called the Gorky estate. Nadezhda Krupskaya answered the phone. What followed was a tirade of abuse that no one had ever dared unleash on the wife of the leader. Stalin screamed at her. He called her a whore and a syphilitic old witch. He threatened to bring her before the Central Control Commission for endangering Lenin's health. Krupskaya, a woman of immense dignity who had endured exile and revolution without complaint, hung up the phone and collapsed in tears. She did not tell Lenin immediately, fearing the shock would kill him. But the venom of that phone call lingered in the house like a poison. When Lenin eventually learned of the insult, his reaction was cold, white-hot rage. The attack on his wife was not just a personal slight. It was a demonstration of Stalin's belief that Lenin was already a corpse, a relic to be managed while the real men did the work. Lenin realized he was not just fighting for his health. He was fighting for the soul of the revolution against a man who lacked any moral compass. He sat in his wheelchair, his face pale, and dictated a letter to Stalin. I have no intention of forgetting so easily what is done against me. I ask you to weigh carefully whether you are agreeable to retracting your words and apologizing, or whether you prefer the severance of relations between us. It was a declaration of war, but the body could not sustain the spirit's fury. On December 16, 1922, the second major stroke hit. This one was more devastating than the first. It left him bedridden, paralyzed on the right side, and barely able to speak. The door to the outside world slammed shut. The tragedy was absolute. Just as Lenin had gained the clarity to see the danger of Stalin, he lost the physical power to stop him. Trapped in the twilight of his room, unable to attend meetings or give speeches, Lenin turned to the only weapon he had left: dictation. He began to compose a series of notes that would become known as his last testament. These were not the raving thoughts of a dying man. They were a lucid, desperate warning to the party Congress. He evaluated his successors with surgical precision. He praised Trotsky's brilliance, but noted his arrogance. He dismissed Kamenev and Zinoviev, but for Stalin, he sharpened his knife. "Comrade Stalin," Lenin dictated, his voice a whisper that his secretary struggled to hear, having become general secretary, has unlimited authority concentrated in his hands, and I am not sure whether he will always be capable of using that authority with sufficient caution. It was a warning, but it wasn't enough. Days later, after dwelling on the insult to his wife and the brutality in Georgia, he added a postscript, a final explosive command. "Stalin is too rude, and this defect, although quite tolerable in our midst and in dealings among us communists, becomes intolerable in a Secretary General. That is why I suggest that the comrades think about a way of removing Stalin from that post and appointing another man in his stead who, in all other respects, differs from Comrade Stalin in having only one advantage, namely that of being more tolerant, more loyal, more polite, and more considerate to the comrades, less capricious, etc. Remove Stalin." The order was explicit. It was the political death warrant of Joseph Stalin. Lenin ordered the notes to be typed up and sealed, to be opened and read aloud only at the next party Congress. He believed he had planted a time bomb that would save the revolution from the dictator he had helped create. He had the secret files locked away in his safe. He believed he had won. But Lenin had forgotten the lesson of his own Red Terror. Power does not respect paper. Power respects only power. And while Lenin was dictating his will to a secretary in a quiet room, Stalin was bugging the telephones. He was interrogating the doctors. He had spies in the household staff. Stalin knew about the testament. He knew about the "remove Stalin" clause, and he knew that as long as the old man breathed, the threat remained. The early months of 1923 were a slow, agonizing descent. Lenin was conscious, but he was a spectator to his own demise. He would ask to be wheeled out onto the veranda to look at the snow. He would watch the birds, his eyes filled with an infinite sadness. He tried to read Hegel and Marx, but the words swam on the page. The frustration was physically painful. He would sometimes howl, a guttural animal sound of pure despair, when he could not find the word for apple or glass. He was also beginning to realize the extent of his isolation. The letters he sent to the Kremlin were often intercepted. The responses he received were polite, empty platitudes drafted by Stalin's secretaries. He was being managed. He was becoming a symbol, a statue before he was even dead. The Lenin the public knew was a hero leading the charge. The real Lenin was a cripple weeping in a wheelchair, surrounded by guards who reported his every twitch to his enemy. In March 1923, the final blow fell. A third stroke, massive and catastrophic, shattered what was left of his nervous system. It stole his speech entirely. He could no longer dictate. He could no longer curse. He could only make monosyllabic sounds. Vot, here, here. He was locked in. The intellect that had analyzed the geopolitics of empires was now trapped inside a skull that could not communicate with the outside world. Stalin visited him during this period. The meetings were macabre. Stalin would sit by the bedside, smoking his pipe, talking jovially about party matters, pretending to consult the leader. Lenin would stare at him, his eyes burning with an impotent rage or sometimes a terrible fear. He would try to gesture, to point, to convey the danger, but his hand would just tremble on the blanket. Stalin would smile, pat his hand, and leave, telling the doctors, "Vladimir Ilyich looks better today." It was the ultimate victory of the bureaucrat over the revolutionary. Stalin didn't need to kill Lenin, he just needed to wait. The tragedy of these final months was biblical. The man who had unleashed the Red Terror, who had argued that sentimentality was a crime, was now drowning in a sea of sentimentality he could not control. He was fed with a spoon. He was lifted onto a chaise longue. He was shown photos of workers carrying banners with his face on them, banners that celebrated a regime that was rapidly twisting into a totalitarian nightmare he had explicitly warned against in his locked safe. He spent his days staring at the trees of Gorky, perhaps thinking of his brother Alexander, hanged by the Tsar, perhaps thinking of the 100 kulaks in Penza, or perhaps thinking of the irony that he, who had ordered so many deaths to secure the future, was now powerless to stop the one death that would doom it. The winter of 1923 dragged on, cold and relentless, burying the hopes of the revolution under a thick blanket of snow. Inside the mansion, the silence deepened. The telegraph machine was silent. The pen lay unused. The architect of terror was waiting for the end. The summer of 1923 at the Gorky estate was a season of haunting silence. The man, who had once electrified crowds with a single gesture, was now reduced to a ghostly figure in a wicker wheelchair. Photographs taken during this period reveal a terrifying transformation. Lenin's face, once defined by its sharp intellectual intensity, had become a mask of wide-eyed shock. His eyes, burning with a mixture of madness, frustration, and pleading, seemed to scream the words his tongue could no longer form. To the outside world, the Soviet press reported that Vladimir Ilyich is recovering and spending time in the fresh air. In reality, he was living through a waking nightmare, a prisoner of his own failing biology in the ruthless political quarantine imposed by Moscow. He spent hours on the veranda, staring at the dense forest that surrounded the estate. He was learning to write with his left hand, scratching out jagged, illegible lines that his sister Maria tried desperately to decipher. Sometimes he was docile, watching the clouds. Other times the rage would return. He would thrash in his chair, pointing furiously at the telephone, demanding to be connected to the Kremlin, to the Politburo, to the world he had built. But the telephone was often disconnected, or the operators had been instructed by Stalin to politely deflect the invalid's requests. The architect of the revolution had become an inconvenience to its new managers. Yet there was one final defiant spark left in the dying ember. On a crisp day in mid-October 1923, Lenin insisted on visiting Moscow. It was a demand made with such guttural intensity that his doctors and guards, perhaps out of pity or fear of his temper, acquiesced. He was helped into his Rolls-Royce, the same car that had carried him bleeding from the factory floor 5 years earlier. This would be his last journey. The drive into Moscow was surreal. The city had changed. The desperate, starving capital of the Civil War was gone, replaced by the bustling energy of the new economic policy, a policy Lenin himself had designed to save the economy by allowing limited capitalism. He saw shops full of goods, people walking without fear of immediate execution, a semblance of normalcy returning. But as the car passed through the gates of the Kremlin, the atmosphere shifted. The guards, recognizing the figure in the back seat, snapped to attention. their faces registering shock. They were seeing a ghost. Lenin was wheeled into his old apartment. He moved through the rooms like a specter haunting his own life. He went to his study. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The lamp, the papers, the books on philosophy and economics. He picked up a few volumes, his hand trembling, caressing the spines. He looked at the empty chair where he had sat to redraw the map of Europe. He went to the agricultural exhibition nearby, observing the fruits of the Soviet harvest. But he did not speak. He could not make a speech. He was an observer, a tourist in the empire he had founded. The most crushing moment came when he visited his private library. He saw the logs of who had checked out books. He saw the new decrees on his desk, decrees he had not signed, decisions made by the troika of Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The machine was running perfectly without him. He was not essential. He was already history. As evening fell, he was driven back to Gorky. Those who saw him leave said he looked devastated, sinking deep into his coat, his eyes fixed on the receding towers of the Kremlin. He knew he would never see them again. He had built a fortress of power, and now he was locked out of it. Winter descended on Gorky. The snow piled high against the windows, sealing the estate in a white tomb. As 1923 bled into 1924, Lenin's condition seemed to stabilize, offering a cruel glimmer of hope. He attended a Christmas tree party organized for the children of the estate staff. Though the Bolsheviks officially frowned on Christmas, the tradition persisted. He sat in his wheelchair, watching the children play, a faint, lopsided smile on his face. For a brief moment, the revolutionary who had ordered mass executions was just a dying old man finding comfort in the laughter of children. But the reprieve was a lie. The arteries in his brain were hardening into stone, the result of a condition that had killed his father at a similar age, exacerbated by the stress of the revolution and the trauma of the bullet wound. On the morning of January 21st, 1924, Lenin woke up feeling agitated. He refused his breakfast. His eyes were darting around the room, filled with a panic that his nurses could not soothe. By the afternoon, his temperature spiked dangerously. He began to gasp for air. The doctors were summoned. They found him in the throes of a massive seizure. The end was not peaceful. It was a violent physical struggle. His body was racked by spasms that twisted his limbs. His breath came in loud, rattling rasps that echoed through the quiet house. Nadezhda Krupskaya stood by the bedside, holding his hand, whispering to him, watching the man she had followed into exile and revolution disintegrate before her eyes. At 6:50 p.m., the spasms ceased. Vladimir Lenin let out a long final exhale. His body went limp. The blood rushed from his face, leaving it with a waxen yellow pallor. The room fell silent. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked on. The man who had declared that revolutions are the locomotives of history had reached his final stop. He was 53 years old. The brain that had masterminded the October Revolution had ceased to function, but the political machine it created was just beginning its true ascent. The immediate reaction in the room was paralyzed shock, but outside the door, the machinery of the state instantly clicked into gear. The doctors, terrified of being blamed, immediately began documenting the time of death. A call was placed to the Kremlin. When the phone rang in Joseph Stalin's office, he was ready. He had been preparing for this moment for months. He summoned the Politburo. "Lenin is dead," he announced. There were no tears in his eyes. There was only calculation. While others, like Trotsky, who was recovering from an illness in the south of Russia, were paralyzed by the magnitude of the loss, Stalin was already planning the next move. He did not see a corpse. He saw an asset. He saw a symbol that could be weaponized to legitimize his own rule. Even before the body was cold, Stalin began to orchestrate the canonization of Lenin. He proposed something that went against every Marxist principle Lenin had ever held. He proposed that Lenin should not be buried. Lenin had explicitly requested to be buried next to his mother in St. Petersburg in a simple grave. He hated idolatry. He hated religious ritual. But Stalin argued that Lenin belonged to the masses. He argued that the body should be preserved, displayed, and worshipped like the relic of a saint in a new secular religion. Trotsky, when he heard of the plan, was horrified. "This is madness," he wrote. "This is replacing the relics of the saints with the relics of Vladimir Ilyich." But Trotsky was far away, and Stalin was in Moscow. That night at Gorky, a sculptor was summoned to make a death mask. The doctors performed an autopsy on the kitchen table. They sawed open the skull of the genius of the revolution. What they found shocked them. The blood vessels in his brain were calcified. When tapped with tweezers, they sounded like stone. The damage was catastrophic. Massive sections of the brain tissue had atrophied, practically petrified by the disease. The doctors marveled that he had been able to live, let alone think, for so long with such devastation inside his head. It was the final testament to his sheer, terrifying force of will. But as the doctors stitched the body back together, preparing it for the train ride to Moscow, they were unwittingly preparing the first prop for the stage of the Stalinist era. The man was gone. The god was about to be born. The journey of Vladimir Lenin's body from Gorky to Moscow was a procession of ice and grief. On January 23, 1924, the coffin, draped in red fabric, was carried out of the estate on the shoulders of his closest comrades. The temperature had plunged to 30 degrees below zero. It was a cold so profound that the breath of the mourners froze instantly in the air, creating a fog of sorrow around the procession. Peasants from the surrounding villages, the very people Lenin had claimed to represent and often ruthlessly suppressed, lined the snowy path. They knelt in the drifts, crossing themselves, blending the old Orthodox faith with the new Bolshevik religion. The little father was dead, and in the Russian soul, the death of a czar, even a red one, was a seismic event. The body was loaded onto a special funeral train. As the steam engine chugged slowly toward the capital, thousands of bonfires were lit along the tracks to keep the mourners warm. From the window of the carriage, the Bolshevik leaders looked out at a landscape illuminated by fire and snow, a visual testament to the sheer scale of the cult that was already forming. But inside the train, the political maneuvering had not ceased. Joseph Stalin, dressed in a heavy military greatcoat, remained close to the coffin, positioning himself physically as the chief mourner, the heir apparent guarding the legacy. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles to the south, in the warm, subtropical air of Sukhumi, Leon Trotsky received a telegram. It was from Stalin. It informed him of Lenin's death, but added a crucial, calculated lie. "The funeral will take place on Saturday. You cannot get back in time. The Politburo thinks that because of the state of your health, you must proceed to Sukhumi." In reality, the funeral was scheduled for Sunday. Trotsky could have made it, but he believed the lie. He stayed in the South, nursing a fever and his own arrogance, while in Moscow his absence was noted by everyone. It was a masterstroke of bureaucratic treachery. To the masses, Trotsky's empty seat at the funeral looked like arrogance or indifference. To the party elite, it signaled that the lion of the revolution was losing his teeth. In Moscow, the body lay in state at the Hall of Columns. For 4 days and nights, a river of humanity flowed past the open casket, Nearly 1 million people waited in lines that stretched for miles, stamping their feet to keep the blood moving, waiting for a glimpse of the waxen face of the leader. Inside the hall, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and fir branches, masking the chemical smell of the embalming fluids. The silence was punctuated only by the shuffling of boots and the weeping of old women. On January 27th, the funeral took place on Red Square. The cold was apocalyptic. The brass instruments of the military bands froze. The musicians had to grease their lips to prevent them from sticking to the mouthpieces. At 4 p.m., as the coffin was lowered into a temporary wooden mausoleum, a signal was given. Every factory whistle, every train siren, every steamship horn across the entire Soviet Union sounded at once. For 3 minutes, the largest country on earth screamed in unison. It was a mechanical wail of mourning, a terrifying display of the collective power Lenin had unleashed. Standing atop the mausoleum, Stalin delivered an oration that sounded less like a Marxist analysis and more like a religious litany. Comrade Lenin bequeathed to us the duty of maintaining and strengthening the dictatorship of the proletariat. He intoned, "We vow to thee, Comrade Lenin, that we shall spare no effort to fulfill this bequest with honor." With every "we vow to thee," Stalin was not just burying a leader, he was stealing his mantle. He was transforming Lenin's complex, often contradictory political thoughts into a rigid catechism, a Bible of Leninism of which he was the only interpreter. But there was still one threat hanging over Stalin's head: the testament, the secret notes in the safe, the "Remove Stalin" clause. In May 1924, 4 months after the funeral, the 13th Party Congress convened in Moscow. The atmosphere was tense. Lenin's widow, Nadezhda Krupskaya, finally handed over the documents. She insisted they be read to the Central Committee. This was the moment that could have changed history. If the party leaders had followed Lenin's dying wish, Stalin would have been stripped of his power. The scene in the committee room was suffocating. Lev Kamenev read the notes aloud. When he reached the section about Stalin, Stalin is too rude. I propose the comrades find a way to remove him. A heavy silence fell. Stalin sat in the corner, his face a mask, puffing on his pipe, waiting for the axe to fall. He offered to resign. It was a gamble, a piece of political theater. But then Grigory Zinoviev stood up. Zinoviev, who feared Trotsky more than he feared Stalin, spoke the words that sealed the fate of the Soviet Union. "Comrades," he said, "every word of Ilyich is law to us, but we are happy to say that on one point Lenin's fears have proved baseless. I am referring to the point about our General Secretary." He argued that Stalin had improved, that the party needed unity, that removing him would only help the Trotskyite faction. The committee, exhausted by infighting and fearful of a split, chose the path of least resistance. They voted not to publish the testament. They voted to keep it a secret, read only to restricted delegations, and then buried in the archives. Stalin was saved by the very men he would later execute. He had survived the bullet of Fanny Kaplan, and now he had survived the pen of Vladimir Lenin. With the testament suppressed, the cult of Lenin went into overdrive. The temporary wooden mausoleum was replaced by a granite tomb. The brain of the leader was sliced into 30,000 segments and studied by scientists looking for the source of genius. His image was printed on millions of posters, stamps, and badges. Petrograd was renamed Leningrad. But this deification had a dark purpose. By elevating Lenin to the status of a god, Stalin made himself the high priest. To question Stalin became equivalent to questioning Lenin, and to question Lenin was to question the revolution itself. The Hanging Order and the Red Terror were whitewashed, repackaged not as acts of desperation or violence, but as holy acts of of revolutionary justice. As the 1920s wore on, the old Bolsheviks, the men who had sat with Lenin in the smoke-filled cafes of Zurich and the trenches of the Civil War, began to realize their mistake. They saw the rudeness Lenin had warned about growing into a monstrous tyranny. But it was too late. The trap had snapped shut. The machine of terror that Lenin had built to crush the kulaks and the whites was now being turned inward toward the party itself. The Red Terror was evolving into the Great Terror. By the mid-1930s, the snow that covered Lenin's grave had hardened into permafrost. The Soviet Union had been transformed. The chaotic, desperate experimentation of the early revolutionary years was gone, replaced by a monolithic state machine that hummed with terrifying efficiency. And at the controls of this machine sat Joseph Stalin, the man Lenin had begged his comrades to remove. The rudeness Lenin had warned of had metastasized into a paranoia so vast it would consume the nation. The road to the Great Terror wasn't paved in the 1930s. It was paved in 1918. Stalin was not an aberration. He was the faithful executor of Lenin's will. The Cheka became the NKVD. The isolated prison of Solovki grew into the sprawling gulag. Stalin simply took the weapon Lenin had forged and aimed it at everyone. The most chilling parallel, however, lies in the philosophy of the show trial. Remember Lenin's hanging order: hang them without fail, so the people see, so the people tremble. Lenin understood that death needed to be a performance to be effective. Stalin took this concept and built a grand theater around it. In 1936, the old Bolsheviks, the very men who had stood by Lenin's side, the men who had voted to suppress his testament, found themselves in the spotlight of this dark theater. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, the men who had saved Stalin's career in 1924, were arrested. They were not charged with corruption or incompetence. They were charged with being part of a Trotskyite, Zinovievite terrorist center, plotting to kill Stalin. It was a fabrication so absurd it defied logic, yet the system demanded they confess to it. The interrogation methods used to extract these confessions were a direct evolution of the Red Terror. Sleep deprivation, beatings, threats against families. The iron and blood Lenin had advocated for the enemy was now being used on the founding fathers of the party. Broken and demoralized, Zinoviev and Kamenev agreed to confess in open court, promised their lives would be spared if they did. The trial was broadcast to the world. It was the hanging order writ large. The entire nation watched as these once great revolutionaries stood in the dock, parroting a script written by their torturers, calling themselves mad dogs and fascist spies. It was a psychological ritual, a public degradation designed to destroy not just the bodies of the opposition, but their legacies. When the verdict was read, death by shooting, the promise of mercy was instantly broken. On August 25, 1936, Zinoviev and Kamenev were dragged into the basement of the Lubyanka. As the executioners raised their pistols, it is said that Zinoviev, hysterical with fear, cried out to the God he had spent his life denying, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Kamenev, more stoic, told him to be quiet and die with dignity. The shots rang out. The men who had ignored Lenin's dying warning were liquidated by the monster they had helped unleash. But the terror did not stop at the elite. It trickled down into the mud of the villages, repeating the tragedy of 1918 on a continental scale. Just as Lenin had waged war on the kulaks to seize grain, Stalin launched collectivization. He declared war on the peasantry to fund his industrialization. The result was the Holodomor of 1932 to 1933, a man-made famine that makes the 1921 hunger look almost minor by comparison. In Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, millions starved. The NKVD cordoned off villages, preventing peasants from leaving to find food. Watchtowers were built over wheat fields. Anyone found stealing a handful of grain, socialist property, was shot on sight. This was the hanging order perfected. Entire populations were sentenced to a slow, agonizing death to serve the ideology of the state. In the villages, the silence of the dead was deafening. Mothers ate their own children in fits of insanity. Carts collected bodies like refuse. And in Moscow, Stalin denied the famine existed, exporting grain to the West to buy machinery while his people ate bark and grass. The necessary cruelty that Lenin had intellectualized had become a genocide. As the decade drew to a close, the purge turned inward once more. The NKVD began to consume itself. The executioners were executed. Genrikh Yagoda, the head of the secret police who oversaw the early purges, was shot. His successor, Nikolai Yezhov, the bloodthirsty dwarf, presided over the peak of the terror before being taken to a basement and shot himself. In this churning bloodbath, the image of Lenin remained pristine. In fact, it grew brighter. Stalin used Lenin as a shield. Every execution was carried out in the name of Lenin. Every purge was a defense of Leninism. The man who had died helpless in a wheelchair was now the omnipresent god of a death cult. His face was on the banners that floated above the parades in Red Square, looking down with a stern, approving gaze at the rows of tanks and the marching columns of the new Soviet man. Yet there were moments when the ghost of the real Lenin seemed to haunt the proceedings. In 1937, during the height of the purges, Nadezhda Krupskaya, now an old and marginalized woman, tried to speak out. She wrote a letter attempting to defend some of the old comrades being slaughtered. Stalin's response was chilling. He threatened to announce that she was not Lenin's wife, but that another woman had been. The party can appoint anyone to be Lenin's widow, he reportedly sneered. It was the ultimate erasure. The state now owned the truth. It owned history. It owned Lenin. By 1939, the Soviet Union was a graveyard of the original revolutionaries. Of the members of the Central Committee who had met in 1917 to launch the October Revolution, almost all were dead, executed by Stalin. The only survivor was Stalin himself, and the exiled Trotsky, who would soon feel the reach of the NKVD's ice pick in Mexico. The historical argument was settled in blood. Lenin had argued that a vanguard party operating with absolute discipline and ruthlessness was necessary to guide the masses. He had created a structure where power flowed from the top down, where dissent was treason, and where the courts were instruments of policy, not justice. He had believed that he and men like him, intellectuals, idealists, would wield this weapon. He never imagined that a man like Stalin, a bank robber, a thug, a bureaucrat, would pick it up. But the weapon was designed to be used. The hanging order was not an aberration. It was the prototype. The Red Terror was not a temporary measure. It was the foundation. The tragic reality that the world was forced to confront as the 20th century marched toward its second Great War was that the Gulag was not a corruption of the system. The Gulag was the system, and its architect, lying embalmed in his crystal coffin, was the silent partner in every crime that followed. In the heart of Moscow, beneath the red granite of the step pyramid on Red Square, lies the most potent symbol of the Soviet paradox. Here, in a glass sarcophagus, rests the body of Vladimir Lenin, but the existence of this body is in itself a grotesque betrayal of the man it used to be. Lenin was a materialist. He believed that death was the end, that the soul was a fiction, and that matter simply decayed. He had explicitly asked to be buried in the earth, to return to the cycle of nature. Instead, he was turned into a miracle. For decades, a secret team of scientists known as the Lenin Lab has worked tirelessly to defy the laws of biology. Every 18 months, the body is removed from the sarcophagus and submerged in a bath of glycerol and potassium acetate. The skin is monitored for fungus. The joints are manipulated to remain flexible. The eyelashes are replaced. It is a macabre science, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of immortality. The message to the Soviet people was clear. Lenin did not die. He merely rests. And because he is physically present, his authority is eternal. This mausoleum of the living became the spiritual center of the Soviet universe. It replaced the holy relics of the Orthodox saints. The long, snaking line of visitors who waited for hours in the snow, peasants, workers, foreign delegations, were performing a pilgrimage. They shuffled into the dark, cool chamber in reverent silence, gazing upon the illuminated face of the leader. They were told that this man had unlocked the secrets of history, that he had found the scientific path to paradise. But in reality, they were worshiping a waxen doll, a hollow shell from which the brain and the internal organs had long been removed. The preservation of the body mirrored the preservation of the ideology. Just as the scientists pumped chemicals into the corpse to keep it from rotting, the Soviet state pumped propaganda into the minds of its citizens to keep the dream of 1917 alive. But the dream, like the body, was dead. What remained was the structure Lenin had built, the party of a new type. This is the true dark legacy of Vladimir Lenin. It is not just the hanging order or the Cheka. It is the invention of the totalitarian state. Before Lenin, dictators were content to control the bodies of their subjects, to tax them, to conscript them, to silence them. Lenin wanted more. He wanted to control their minds. He created a system where there was no private sphere. Art, science, literature, family life, everything was political. Everything had to serve the revolution. He introduced the concept of the one-party state, outlawing all opposition. He introduced the ban on factions within the party, silencing internal debate. He created the network of secret police and camps. These were not temporary measures of the Civil War. They became the DNA of the Soviet system, and this DNA was infectious. The Lenin model became the most successful export of the Soviet Union. In China, Mao Zedong studied Lenin's methods of peasant mobilization and ruthless purging. In North Korea, Kim Il-sung adopted the cult of personality, taking the deification of the leader to even more absurd heights. In Cambodia, Pol Pot, a student of French Marxism, took Lenin's logic of class cleansing to its ultimate genocidal conclusion in the killing fields. The methodology of the hanging order, the public execution of class enemies to terrorize the population, was repeated in Beijing, in Pyongyang, in Havana, in Addis Ababa. The 20th century became a laboratory where Lenin's experiment was repeated over and over again, always with the same result: a river of blood shed in the name of a future that never arrived. There is a profound historical argument that suggests the Cold War was not just a conflict between nations, but a conflict between the human spirit and the machine Lenin built. The West looked at the Soviet Union and saw a prison. The Soviets looked at the West and saw chaos. But the Soviet prison was built on a lie, the lie that the party was infallible, that it spoke with the voice of history. As the decades wore on, the cracks in the monolith began to appear. In 1956, 3 years after Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev stood before the 20th Party Congress and delivered his secret speech. He denounced Stalin's crimes. He revealed the torture, The false confessions, the mass executions, it was a seismic shock. But Khrushchev made a critical distinction. He blamed Stalin, but he absolved Lenin. He argued that Stalin had deviated from the holy path of Leninism. The regime tried to return to the purity of Lenin. They tore down Stalin's statues. They removed Stalin's body from the mausoleum, where it had lain next to Lenin for 8 years, and buried it by the Kremlin wall. But they could not escape the truth. Stalin had walked through the door that Lenin had opened. The Gulag was built on the foundation of the Solovki camp. The KGB was the child of the Cheka. You could not have one without the other. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was a tired giant. The economy, crippled by the inefficiencies of central planning, another Leninist invention, was collapsing. The ideology had become a joke that nobody believed but everyone repeated. The new Soviet man was cynical, exhausted, and hungry. The terror had subsided. People were no longer being shot in basements by the thousands. But the stagnation was suffocating. And in the center of it all, amidst the crumbling empire, the body in the mausoleum remained. The skin was becoming more translucent, the maintenance more difficult. The Lenin lab struggled to keep the illusion alive as the funds dried up. It was a perfect metaphor, a chemically sustained corpse presiding over a rotting state. The tragedy of Lenin's significance is that he destroyed the old world of czarist tyranny only to replace it with a new, more efficient form of tyranny. He liberated the Russians from the Tsar only to enslave them to the party. He promised a dictatorship of the proletariat, but he delivered a dictatorship over the proletariat. He was a man of immense intellect who fell victim to the most dangerous delusion of all, the belief that he knew the ultimate truth and that this truth justified any cost. He believed that he could force humanity to be free, even if he had to kill half of them to do it. As we approach the final chapter of this story, we must look at the ultimate unraveling. The Soviet Union did not end with a bang, but with a signature on a piece of paper. But the shadow of the man who started it all, the man with the bullet in his neck and the pen in his hand, stretches far beyond the fall of the Berlin Wall. It stretches into the psychology of modern power, into the temptation of every leader who believes that their vision is more important than human lives. The end of the story arrives not with a bang, but with the squeal of a crane and the crumbling of stone. In 1991, 74 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, the experiment finally ran out of fuel. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The satellite states of Eastern Europe had broken their chains, and in the squares of cities from Warsaw to Kiev, the bronze giants were being toppled. The statues of Vladimir Lenin, thousands of them, standing in coats of iron pointing endlessly toward a radiant future, were pulled down by the very masses they were supposed to lead. Ropes were tied around their necks. As the cranes hoisted them into the air, they dangled helplessly, swaying in the wind. It was a visual echo that history had scripted with cruel precision. The man who had written the hanging order, commanding that his enemies be strangled so the people would see, was now being symbolically hanged in effigy by the people themselves. On December 25, 1991, the final act played out. The red flag, with its hammer and sickle, the symbols of the worker and the peasant, was lowered from the Kremlin flagpole for the last time. It was replaced by the tricolor of the Russian Federation. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. The superpower that had terrified the world, the empire built on the bones of the kulaks and the blood of the old Bolsheviks, simply evaporated into the cold night air. In the aftermath, the archives were thrown open. The secrets that had been guarded by the KGB for decades spilled out into the light. The hanging order was published. The lists of execution quotas signed by Lenin were revealed. The letters demanding the shooting of priests and the gassing of peasants were read by a stunned public. The myth of the good Lenin versus the bad Stalin was shattered forever. The documents proved that the machinery of death had not been hijacked. It had been designed that way. Today, Red Square is different. It is a place of commerce and tourism. Bright lights from luxury department stores shine on the cobblestones where the tanks used to roll. But the ziggurat of red granite still stands. The mausoleum is still there. Inside, the body of Vladimir Lenin remains, but the reverence is gone. The long lines of pilgrims have been replaced by curious tourists and those nostalgic for a lost empire. The silence of the tomb feels less like a church and more like a museum of curiosities. There is a perpetual debate in modern Russia about what to do with him. Bury him, say the Orthodox Church and the Democrats. Let him return to the earth. Keep him, say the communists. He is our history. So he remains in limbo, suspended between the world of the living and the world of the dead, just as his legacy is suspended between the dream of equality and the nightmare of tyranny. He is a hostage to the future, trapped in the glass box he never wanted, guarded by soldiers of a country that no longer follows his creed. When we look back at the life of Vladimir Lenin, we do not see a monster in the conventional sense. We see something perhaps more terrifying, a man of absolute conviction, a man who believed so deeply in the happiness of humanity that he was willing to slit the throat of any human who stood in his way. He was the boy who mourned his hanged brother and swore to avenge him. He was the intellectual who sat in the library of the British Museum, dreaming of a world without hunger. He was the strategist who seized power in a vacuum, and he was the invalid in the wheelchair, watching the snowfall at Gorky, realizing too late that the violence he had authorized had taken on a life of its own. The tragedy of Lenin is the tragedy of the 20th century. It is the lesson that the road to hell is not just paved with good intentions, it is paved with the belief that the end justifies the means. It teaches us that when you detach morality from politics, when you reduce human beings to classes or obstacles, you open the door to the abyss.